What you see is what you get.
Hello, my name is Pastor Chris Miller, and I am your host on the PC Speaking Podcast, where we are equipping Christians for life. Hello, and welcome back. I hope you found our previous series, SALT, helpful, that we went through in January. Speak, apply, live, and tell the truth. I've decided going forward that I'm going to try to record these podcasts with you, the listener, specifically in mind. I'm learning how to navigate this online ministry thing as we go forward. I definitely consider you very important, and you are part of my ministry if you would like to be so. And I do care about you and pray for you. And to provide pastoral care as I'm able online. I know today people, some people attend church in person, and there's this growing crowd of people who are becoming more virtual online church. And we'll just figure out how to navigate that as we go forward. But this is specifically for you. Sometimes because I was busy in the past, I would rip the audio from Sunday morning's sermon that I, preached to the church and put it up as a podcast, which is a time saver, to be honest. But I do care about you, so this is specifically for you. But we finished up SALT last week, and I know if you're like me, when you think of SALT in Scripture, you might think of Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16. And I'll read you those to you. This is the Sermon on the Mount, or part of it. And this is what it says. You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how shall it be made salty? It is from then on good for nothing, but to be thrown out and to be trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Verse 15. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a basket, but on a candlestick, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Well, after SALT, in that passage, Jesus mentions light. And his people, you and I, we're salt. We're salt and light in the world. And light is going to be the title of our next series. We're going to be using it as an acronym in each week. Each letter will be it'll represent the topic we're going to speak about. But salt and light do many things. Salt prevents decay, spoilage. It enhances flavor. It creates thirst. It purifies. Light can also purify. It illuminates, guides, exposes darkness. It attracts. It provides warmth. It provides comfort. Now, going forward, a big part of this year, something we're doing in person and online too, we'd love to have you participate, is we'll be learning about and doing things that help us act as salt and light. And I've had the privilege of visiting and even speaking in many, many churches, and every church has a personality. If you've been to different churches, you know what I'm talking about. And it's kind of I guess you could say it's a conglomeration of the people that make up the church. The pastor will have a big influence on that as well. And whether they realize it or not, along with that personality, every church also has a shared purpose or focus, even if they don't know what it is. I was part of a church for a while, excuse me, that had Sunday school for kids and adults, then church service. Then on Sunday evening, they had another version of Sunday school for kids and adults, and another church service, which where I'm at in Australia, that sounds like an awful lot. In different parts of the world, that's not a lot, but here it is. But I remember when I was at this particular church, Christmas Day fell on Sunday that year, and nothing changed. There was no break in any of it. It was all very repetitive. We did the exact same thing. No, I don't know that anyone really liked it, but it was just what we did. And I asked myself, why are we doing this? We all understood what we were doing. A smaller group of people understood how it was done. The ones who planned it made it happen. But I don't know that anyone really knew why, or at least they didn't share the same why. Why did we need to do all that stuff week after week, year after year, even on Christmas Day, even though it was pretty repetitive? And the reality is there's a lot of stuff that goes on in churches that really doesn't have a reason. It doesn't really have a why. Even at Hinterland here in person, we've done away with a lot of things we used to do in the past. We don't have much in the way of extras here, but when we come together, we all understand what we're doing. We're attending church. A smaller group of people understand how we do it, how communications work, how things end up on the screen, how the soundboard works, how people are greeted, how church happens. A lot of people understand, what we're doing when we come. A smaller group, volunteers, understand how everything happens. Everybody knows that. But what if we ask, why do we do it? Why do we do what we do? Why are we here? Why are you here? Why are you listening? There are probably several reasons that people would come up with. And sometimes it's just because that's just what we're supposed to do on Sunday. We show up because that's what you do. You go to church. I do it because I want to see people I know and like. And, those are both good reasons. I go to church because it's what I'm supposed to do. I go to see the people I like. Nothing wrong with those at all. But why we do something determines how much motivation we have and how much resistance we're willing to endure to keep doing that thing. And if I were to come to church to see the people, as great as they are, I love the people, I really do. When the people change or move on, which they inevitably do, because especially here on the Gold Coast, things are very transient. But when people move on, if they're the reason I show up, well, the reason why I'm showing up has moved on, and well, I'll stop showing up. If the reason why I attend church is because I just feel like it's something I'm supposed to do, well, that's not a very strong why either. And when we come against a smaller round of resistance, like, I don't really feel like it today, kind of like me. Sometimes I wake up on Sunday morning and think, I don't really feel like it today. If our reason is just because, well, that's just something I'm supposed to do, when the resistance happens, it's going to overcome the why, and I'm just not going to show up. And that gets easier and easier as time goes on. Now, for me, when I was a kid, my parents and my grandmother made me attend church. My grandmother wanted me to go just because she thought that's what I should do. Well, and obviously, it obviously paid some dividends because here I am as a pastor later in life. I think my parents were happy to have a break. I can't blame them. Some people send their kids to church to get a break, and that's just the reality. But the moment they stopped making me go, I stopped going. And because my why disappeared. Why did I go? Because they made me go. And when they stopped making me go, I stopped going. And the why disappears. When the why disappears, so does the motivation and the endurance. And this isn't about church attendance. I want to make that very clear. Those are just illustrations. This is about living life as a disciple of Jesus and defining why we do what we do. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow." And meaning that if someone has a strong enough reason or purpose for doing what they do, they can endure almost anything. And as God's people, we need to consider why we do what we do. And in my experience, many of the things done in churches they're done for different reasons. Sometimes it's to fill a time slot. Sometimes it's for entertainment. Sometimes it's to look busy. Sometimes it's because, well, that church is doing it. I guess we should be doing it too. And pastors they're notorious for filling time slots. Unfortunately, I feel like I've kind of gotten over that and really, like, if don't have a good why, then, well, there's really no reason to do it. But our why determines what we do and how we do it. And if we don't clarify what it is, we'll still have it. We just won't understand what it is, and it's going to happen on its own. So it's something we need to clarify for ourselves. Our why is the difference between a can-do attitude and a poor me attitude. It's the difference between endurance or giving up when things get difficult, which they inevitably will. Now, you and I are Christians today because Christians throughout history have had an incredibly strong why. And that why has always been about Jesus. It's been about finding Jesus, following Jesus, and growing in our walk with him, and doing that together as a community. Christianity is a community. A church is community. And today we're working through this online community and what that's going to look like going forward. But we do it together. That we're a community of people who are all about people finding Jesus, following Jesus, and growing in our walk with him. And we're at our best when we share the same why. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because we grow together as we find and follow Jesus. That's our why. And in saying that, we're all in different places, but we all share in it together. Some people are just finding Jesus. Some have been following Jesus for a long time, but we all grow together as we find and follow Jesus. And now you used this illustration yesterday at church, and somebody come up and called me on it and said, I don't know if I agree with that. And they're probably right. But I'll go ahead and tell you, then I'll tell you the story behind what I just said. But if you take a guitar tuner and you tune 100 guitars, they'll all be in tune. I'm a guitar player, so I use guitar tuner and guitars in this illustration. But if you tune one guitar and then tune the other guitars off of each other, they're all going to sound different and they're not going to work well together. But somebody came up to me after church yesterday and was like, hey, well, what if somebody's got perfect pitch? And I thought, well, I suppose that's true. But if I were doing it, they would sound very different. And that's a biblical concept. Proverbs 29:18 says, where there is no vision, the people perish, but happy is he who keeps the teaching. That's often used as a verse for casting vision in church, although that's kind of sometimes pulled a little bit out of context. But long story short, that word perish, where it says the people perish, means the people wander in different directions. If they don't have a common reason for doing what they're doing, they're going to wander off in different directions. They're going to go and randomly wander. And inevitably, what's going to happen is there's going to be conflict. But imagine everyone sharing the same why. And that why fuels and determines what we do and how we do it. We would be unified and effective, and we would all be influencing our local community. Now, going back to the church I mentioned earlier, the Christmas church, personally, I've always felt church programs like that are just too much. People are so busy today, and giving them that much to do, just for me, it seems like overkill. But I don't know, it may work great where you are, but I just always felt like it's a bit much. And often those things cause more problems than they solve. And sometimes people are so busy filling their head with knowledge that the knowledge never transfers to their heart and then onto their feet. There isn't much transformation and there's even less action. Now, I saw a post a few nights ago on social media, someone who's making a new Left Behind movie. I think this is number 4. I guess I didn't learn their lesson the first 3 times. But I'm just joking around. I've never seen the movies. I don't really know whether they're good or not. But I was reading the comments on this advertisement for this new Left Behind movie, and it was very telling because everyone had an opinion on the timing of the rapture. Nothing gets Christians quite as excited as the rapture, when the saints are caught up to be with the Lord. And everyone had very strong opinions, but very weak Christian character. There are plenty of opinions, but I noticed there was a glaring omission of Christian character. People were being terrible to each other, as they often are in comment sections, but Christians shouldn't be like that. And as I've thought and prayed about it, I've asked, if we're going to grow together as we find and follow Jesus, that's why we're here. But what are we going to do, and how are we going to do it? So, we're going to grow together as we find and follow Jesus. And we're all in different places in that, but we're all growing together. But in regards to that, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? How are we going to move what's in our head to our heart? How is God going to use that to transform us? And then how will it move us to a place where we bring to life the principles of the Scripture in our community? Not just something to do, but something that helps us grow together as we find and follow Jesus. Another opinion, I don't think we learn much when we only hear something. We only retain about, 20% of what we hear. But we learn a lot more when we actually experience something. When we hear something and then we experience it as well, our retention rate goes way up. When I was in the military, we would spend, 30 minutes learning something and then the rest of the day doing it. And when we go out into our respective communities, that's when we really experience being a follower of Jesus. And each week, I want us to experience being a follower of Jesus. And the great thing about that is it doesn't have to be complicated. It's not a complicated thing to do. It takes a little bit of discipline, a little bit of willpower to get us rolling. But the why behind it is the fuel that keeps it going. And each week, I'm going to do my best to share an eternal principle with you, an unshakable biblical truth that will stand any trial and the test of time, something that I know this is true, I know it works, and I can rely on it. And then we have that principle in our head, and the Holy Spirit is going to help move that to our heart and transform who we are. So each week, I'm going to give you a way to bring that principle to life, to take it with you out into your community and bring it to life in your own life and in the life of others. And we're going to do our best to do that every week. We'll have ups and downs with that. It won't always be a perfect fit, but we are going to do our best. And that's a big challenge for me. It's also a big challenge for you. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to take an eternal principle and bring it to life in your community each week? Might be in your family, maybe your community, your work, whatever it might be. But imagine the impact we could have in our community if we all do that. If we absorb one eternal principle from our head to our heart, we go into our community and we bring it to life. Just one principle each week. And if we can do that, I think the Lord will use us in ways we can't even begin to imagine. Now, here's our eternal, unchanging, forever principle for this week. Jesus calls us to love with intentional, sacrificial love that transforms lives, relationships, and communities. One more time, Jesus calls us to love with intentional, sacrificial love that transforms lives, relationships, and communities. So let's put that in our head. We're going to start there. We're going to pray the Lord will transfer that to our heart, transforming who we are. And then at the end of today's message, I'm going to give you a way to bring that to life in your community. Jesus calls us to love with an intentional, sacrificial love that transforms lives, relationships, and communities. We're going to read from Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 39. This is what they say. Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." I'm going to give context for understanding, but I'm going to try to pare it down to mostly just what we need. There's always more you can talk about. There's always more that can be said, but we're going to try to keep it to a reasonable length. But in our passage, someone who has a head full of Old Testament law, an expert in law, asked Jesus a question. Now, just before this passage, Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? Our passage that we just read is his answer to that question. To better understand what Jesus says, it's helpful to understand the culture in which he says it, and then contrast that with our own culture. Our modern Western culture, that is making a huge assumption. You may not be living in the same culture as me, but the culture in which I live, the culture in which some of my listeners live, our culture is a modern Western culture, and it's very individualistic. Every person has autonomy. The rights of the individual are highly valued. And because of that, modern Western culture is a guilt and innocence culture. How society applies laws is based on guilt or innocence regarding each individual in accordance with those laws. We obey the laws. We teach kids to follow the rules. That's how society functions. We expect people to have an understanding of rules and laws and act accordingly. I was walking through the car park the other day. Where was I at? I don't even remember where I was. But someone had parked their car over the line. They'd taken up about, maybe a quarter or the third of the parking space next to them. I remember I was at the hospital. Someone had parked the car over the line. And I don't think there's a law against that. But we all know that's a rule. You park your car inside the lines. That person is guilty of breaking the rule. That's a guilt and innocence culture. We see innocence as being right or righteous. I parked within the lines. I'm right. I'm innocent. The person who didn't do that is guilty. And there are degrees to that as well, of course. There's murder, then maybe robbery, then somewhere lower down the line is not parking between the lines. Or, well, let me reorder that. There's not picking up after your dog in public places, then murder, then robbery. There are degrees to the severity of guilt in modern Western culture. And to those of us who have grown up in that culture, that's how things work. Guilt and innocence. The culture of most of the Bible is an honor-shame culture. Whereas our culture values personal autonomy and individual rights, honor-shame culture holds the collective in high regard, maybe the family, the larger community. It's not just about guilt and innocence, it's about honor and shame. And there's an example of that in John chapter 8 with the woman caught in adultery. The Pharisees try to catch Jesus in a trap of public dishonor. They come out, they threaten to kill this woman. They're going to stone her. Not because of her individual guilt, but because she had dishonored and brought shame on the community. And killing her will restore honor to the community. In our guilt and innocence culture, if someone is guilty of adultery, we see them as guilty, but we don't feel a need to restore honor, so we don't feel the need to punish someone for doing that. Of course, the Bible works in every culture. That's not an issue. But there's a deeper understanding that comes with cultural understanding. For instance, we see degrees of guilt and innocence, which in some cases can actually be a barrier for people in understanding the gospel. When someone asks the question, why does God allow bad things to happen when he has the power to stop them? The person who asks that question sees God as guilty of not doing something he should do. And then why would you trust or give your life to a guilty God? So that's part of our guilt and innocence culture. That can be a challenge to overcome that barrier. Another challenge with degrees of innocence and guilt and understanding the gospel is the idea of being good enough to be accepted by God. And someone who is a very moral person, and there are many people who are very good people, and they think, I'm not perfect, but I'm 90% innocent, 98% innocent. I'm really trying here. And a judge in court would let me go. But you say I'm guilty. But with God's perfect standard, 2% sin makes us 100% lost. But Jesus took all of our guilt and he endured all of our shame on the cross. He covered all the bases. When we understand the cultural difference between guilt and innocence culture, shame and honor culture, when the scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians confront Jesus in Scripture, they're not trying to prove him wrong or guilty. What they're trying to do is shame him publicly. If they can cause Jesus to bring shame to the community, then they can deal with him however they want. And that's what they're constantly trying to do. And when you understand the interactions Jesus has with these different groups from that perspective, it's no longer about proving who's right or wrong, and then everyone goes on their way, which is how we view it through guilt and innocent culture eyes. What Jesus is going through here when he interacts with these different groups is a matter of life and death. Even the cross of Jesus itself, it's as much about shame as it is about death and blood and pain. Jesus had humiliated the religious leaders publicly. He did that multiple times. And if they can shame him, they can take action to restore what they believe to be their honor and the honor of the community. When the religious leaders attack Jesus, they're not trying to say that he's wrong about something. They're trying to say Jesus himself is something wrong. Now, the Pharisees come to Jesus, and someone who has a head full of Old Testament knowledge, law, asked him, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus answers with this: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Theologians at the time were similar to a Christian social media page comment section today. That nobody agrees on anything. And there were a lot of different opinions about how to interpret Scripture, as there still are today. And in this case, the disagreement was how to organize God's commandments into an order of importance. What matters more? Not picking up after your dog or not standing between the lines at the car park. That kind of a scenario. When this expert in the law asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment? He's not looking for an answer. He knows no matter what he says, someone will think he's wrong. They're going to be offended. And he's bringing shame to someone. So it's just another way of trying to get Jesus to bring shame to the community. Jesus answers him, and he says, the first one is love God, and the second one is like it: love your neighbor like you love yourself. Jesus says, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. That means that every Old Testament law and every word of every prophet, all of God's commands are fulfilled in doing these two things: love God, love your neighbor. I put up a story about this this past week on my socials. PC speaking, if you want to follow, please do. If you haven't watched Wes Huff on Joe Rogan, it's worthwhile. Give it a watch. It's very good, or listen to it. But anyway, my Instagram story was part of their conversation. Something Wes says is that when Jesus teaches about the law, he is often teaching that if you're following the letter but not the spirit of the law, you're missing the point. And that fits with what Jesus is teaching here. And he's teaching us a very specific lesson. He says the greatest commandment is to love God, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. In the original language, there's no definite article on the second, which means that there's no the. That means that Jesus is telling us another commandment is like the first one. And we tend to want to order the commandments naturally, like the 10 commandments. We put them in order, 1 through 10. Which one is most important? We like to decide what's more important, especially through our guilt and innocence cultural eyes, where we have severity of guilt and degrees of guilt. But just like anyone else would do, the Pharisees had been trying to rank order the commands of the law, but couldn't agree on the order. And they never will, because they're viewing them as a list when they're not a list. And that's one of the important things Jesus is teaching in this, is they're not a list, even though we read him that way. Jesus is saying, as he often does, you guys are missing the point. You're focused on looking at the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. You know what to do, you know how to do it, but you don't understand why you're doing it. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they knew the law very well. The law was their life. I imagine most Israelites in Jesus' time, most Jewish people, would have known the law very well. They were very dedicated to God. The Pharisees, Sadducees especially, they did their best to keep every little obscure bit of the law. Now, the Pharisees had a tradition where they would devote all of their possessions to God. So everything they had was dedicated to God. And that sounds good. That sounds like, wow, they are really dedicated. But what was happening was they were declaring their possessions dedicated to God, but that allowed them to withhold financial help from parents who were too old to care for themselves, even though they could still use the things they had dedicated to God themselves. Jesus addresses that in Mark 7. He says, you claim you've devoted your possessions to God, but the law says honor your mother and father. In attempting to follow the letter of the law, you've ignored the why, and you're actually breaking the law. Rank ordering commands and prioritizing some above the others leads to following the letter, but not the spirit of the law. It leads to a judgmental attitude. It leads to following the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. In saying what he does in this passage, Jesus is teaching us that there is not an order of importance in the moral commands of Scripture. They're symbiotic. They rely on each other. They work together. The relationship is interdependent. It's all one unit instead of an individual list. One supports the other. They work together. John records this in John 14 and repeats it in 1 John 5. He says, if you love God, you keep his commandments. Jesus says, if you say you love God and hate your brother, you're a liar. Loving God, loving your neighbor are symbiotic. If you don't love your neighbor, but you say you love God, you're a liar. If you're not doing one, you're not doing the other. And these verses also say, I've been, just saying love God, love your neighbor for the sake of brevity, but there's more to these verses. It says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. We're being told we're to love God wholeheartedly and with undivided devotion. Our love for God should shape our life. And we are to love our neighbor like we love ourselves. We sacrifice things for ourselves. We forgive ourselves. We are generous to ourselves. We're kind to ourselves. And Jesus says, I want you to be as selfless as you are selfish. Jesus is teaching our eternal principle. Jesus calls us to love with an intentional, sacrificial love that transforms lives, relationships, and communities. That's a foundational part of following Jesus. Love with an intentional, sacrificial love that transforms lives, relationships, and communities. So then we come back to where we started today. What if we all do that together? What's the world going to look like? What if we focus on taking one eternal principle from our head to our heart, and then we bring it to life in our community? We bring it to life in our life and in the life of others. How are we going to bring intentional, transforming, self-sacrificial love to life in our community? Well, here are 3 ways you can do that. You may be able to think of some others, but I'm going to give you 3. One is forgiveness. Forgive freely. You can't love someone while you're holding a grudge. Be forgiving. And a lot of people struggle with forgiving. If you are, shoot me a message. Let me know. I've got a worksheet that might be helpful. Number 2, be generous. And there are several ways you can do that. And, my wife likes to say, well, you've either got money or time. You have one or the other. And so you can be generous with what you have. And if you're going to do it sacrificially, you're going to be generous with what's most valuable. You can be financially generous. You can be generous with your time. You can be generous with your attention. You can be generous with your encouragement. That's a great way. Here's a great way to be encouraging. Be the person people want to call when something good happens in their life. A lot of people don't share, when something good happens because other people tear it down, tear it apart. When something good happens to someone, celebrate with them. Look for an excuse to celebrate. That's great. I'm happy that happened for you. Let's do something fun. Encouragement is a significant way to show love, and so many people need it. Everybody needs encouragement. Only people who love you are happy when good things happen to you. And the last one is acts of kindness. Perform an act of kindness willingly. We've probably all been to a shop, a restaurant, a cafe or something where they kind of make you feel like you're a burden. Nobody enjoys that. When you ask for something, it feels like you get a bit of an eye roll. Everything's too much trouble. Don't do that and pretend you're doing an act of kindness. Nothing beats someone doing something nice for you when they enjoy doing it. Acts of kindness. So our eternal principle, Jesus calls us to love with an intentional, sacrificial love that transforms lives, relationships, and communities. Now, hopefully, that's making its way from our head to our heart. But it doesn't come to life until we do something with it, until we take it into our community and bring it to life. I know in church, if you're a churchgoer, podcast listener, whatever you might be, we think the message is over when we leave church, or we think the message is over when we close out the podcast or move on to something else. And we think church is over when we go home. But let's take on the mindset that we accomplish church when we bring the principle to life, when we bring it into our own life, when we bring it into the life of others. And here's how to do that this week. I'm going to give you a way that you can bring our eternal principle to life in your own life and in your community. And I challenge you to do that. Here you go. Choose one person this week to show active, intentional, sacrificial love through forgiveness, generosity, or an act of kindness. And then make a note of any transformation that takes place in lives, relationships, or communities as a result. I think you're going to be amazed with what God will do with that if you will bring that to life in your community. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. I'm praying for you. Aim high, work hard, and speak carefully. Talk to you again soon. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who might find it helpful.
Oh, that's good.